Thank you, George. We had a bunch of questions. I want to direct the first one, I guess, to anybody, but start with you, Chairman Green. Somebody sent in a question, why wasn't Mayorkas's repeated examples of perjury referred to prosecution so as to counter the claims that there were no impeachable offenses? Is that something you guys had considered or not? I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, we considered that. We considered contempt of Congress, but it was really beyond that. This rose to the level of impeachment, so we went to, and that's Article 2 of the impeachment articles, you know, breaching of trust to the American people and breaching of trust, the obligations to Congress. And it goes beyond just the false statements. It goes to disregard for the oversight responsibility of Congress, where we would subpoena. I think there were 14 subpoenas that are still unsatisfied from the department. So it's beyond just the dishonesty. It's a complete disregard for this branch of government.
And this is sort of a lawyer's question, a follow-up on that. Was the House Homeland Security Committee or the House as a whole in a position to recommend prosecution for perjury?
Well, I'd say one thing about that. Who would enforce that law?
Yeah. No, I understand that. But I mean, in order to make the argument that, yes, there's actually a criminal side to this as well as the maladministration side.
I mean, my view on that is there are a lot of steps that you theoretically could have taken to dot every I and cross every T, but it would have been a waste of time in the sense that you would see the inevitable conclusion of this. And in the meantime, you would be retaining in office someone who has clearly ordered his staff to violate the law. So there's practical wisdom that has to be brought to bear on which button you push and when,
right.
based on the circumstances.
Okay, interesting. And I had a question again for anybody, but start with you, Chairman Green. Doesn't the way this ended up being killed in the Senate, doesn't that point to a certain institutional dysfunction? Because when the framers set up the system of checks and balances, their assumption was that the various branches would be jealous of their prerogatives. Well, is Congress really jealous of its prerogatives anymore?
I think that's a very fair question, and I mentioned this to my colleagues on multiple occasions. We at some point have to defend the institution.
Right.
And all those senators and all those House members who voted against the impeachment were basically saying, it doesn't matter. The Congress's authority, we're not going to defend the Congress's authority in the Constitution. And I'm grieved by that, and Americans should be grieved by that as well. Clearly the actions of Schumer and the Democrats to basically not even hear the testimony before deciding points to that dysfunction, to use your term. I think it's far more dysfunction, because dysfunction implies that it's an accident. I think there was intention here to do what they did. So again, maybe a better word is subversion of the Constitution and subversion of the power of the United States Congress coming from within.
And to follow up on that, to refer to something Paul said, should we be pushing to repeal the 17th Amendment? Because one of the reasons senators aren't institutionally, in this sense, defending the interest of the states is because, yes, they're elected statewide, but they have no real, the state as an institution really has no hold on them at all. It's just a district.
Well, I mean, if you repeal the 17th Amendment, I'm sure it would stoke the fire under them. But you would think that raw principle alone would be fire enough to motivate them. And if it's not, I mean, maybe the electorate would have something to say. I wanted to just say something really quick about the whole idea of, geez, shouldn't Congress be asserting more of its own authority? So we had a couple of hearings in the committee, and the Democrats invited a couple of law professors to talk about impeachment. Of course, they all opposed it, as does the legal academy generally. It's really like a monocultural echo chamber there. But what's fascinating is, of all of the law professors that the Democrats might pick, they picked two who completely reversed themselves regarding their positions on the previous Trump impeachment. Now, I was fascinated by this. One of the professors was Professor Pearlstein. And earlier on March 3rd, 2020, she had given the following testimony to the House Rules Committee. And again, she ultimately went on to oppose the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas. But back then in 2020, she said, "It has been decades since Congress has effectively asserted its ambition to guard against the staggering accretion of power in the presidency. Congress has acquiesced to broad presidential assertions of authority to act without congressional authorization." And she goes on and on. It's exactly what happened here, but she completely reversed her position because of the political party of the person in question.
So this is kind of a political question, so I guess more for you, Chairman Green. The whole reason DHS exists, the reason the INS was, deconstructed and all of that stuff happened was because of 9/11, was because of immigration and border security. In other words, that's why there is a DHS. And I mean, as an elected official, how do you assess the administration's taking a risk on this? Because isn't this an incredible vulnerability, political vulnerability, in letting literally millions of people who can't be vetted and weren't vetted in any meaningful way into the United States? I mean, something's bound to blow up at some point.
Yeah, that seems to boggle the mind, and it makes people go into the suspicious part of our brain and why they would accept such risk, why Americans would be allowed to die to fentanyl overdose that is, the precursors manufactured in China, brought in through drug cartels, benefiting criminal networks, all of that. Why would that be tolerated? And there are conspiracy theories out there about this, some plausible, some not, but very clearly the risk-benefit, the benefit question is still we don't understand. But the risk question is clearly, we know several 100,000 Americans have died to fentanyl. We know tens have died to automobile accidents. Hundreds have died to criminal actors doing horrible things. We know from FBI testimony before the committee there is no way to guarantee that Hamas doesn't have a cell here that's come across the southern border. We know that the Chinese have sent 50,000 plus people in the last year and a half into the country. We know faking tourists, these Chinese nationals have overwhelmed military installations and taking pictures. We suspect that because the highest year prior to that, there were 1,800 Chinese nationals that crossed in a year, and now it's like close to 30,000, right? That something has happened in China. You can't leave China with the social credit score the way it is without the CCP knowing. This has to be intentional. So the risk is massive, and yet there's some benefit out there, and we can, speculate, but no one's found a smoking gun on it, so I'll be careful to do so. But they can't be this stupid, right? They're not this stupid. There's some benefit to them, and people ought to seriously consider what that benefit is.
Paul? See something real quick. This is from the Fifth Circuit's opinion. Now, part of this, I think, is where the rhetoric of the administration got ahead of them, and these policies kind of got out of control in the following way. This is very interesting what the Fifth Circuit said about that Mayorkas memo ordering his staff to violate federal law. These are the words of the Fifth Circuit. The DHS memo compels officials to comply in a manner that violates statutory law. For example, it provides that the guidelines, quote, are essential to advancing this administration's stated commitment to advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by poverty and inequality. You'll remember at the beginning of the Biden administration, he issued an executive order, which was basically the federal level DEI stuff that a lot of people are retreating from today because of its absurd applications. Well, here's the Fifth Circuit saying that the memo that I quoted earlier, ordering his staff to violate federal law, is prefaced with, we're doing this in order to help implement this DEI executive order. And it's really stark to see the Fifth Circuit saying that perhaps part of this grew out of an effort to try to comply with a DEI executive order.
Yeah, I think that's actually, my sense is the reason for this is not so much that there is some kind of quid pro quo or some kind of actual benefit. I think it is more like what you were saying, Paul, is that it's an ideological capture almost. So, yeah, we have a question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Mark. I actually have two questions. One on national security considerations.
We'll do the first one, and then I'll kind of restate it so people can hear it, and then go ahead.
We have seen in the campus protest the last 2 weeks, half and more of people who have been arrested are not students. Presumably, some portion of them are not citizens. Is this a preview of what might be coming as a result of, as you mentioned, Chairman Green, the thousands of Chinese coming in?
So you're asking me to be speculative on the future. Politicians are very reticent to do that.
And we always ask the question.
Yeah, I do. I know. Let me put my military hat on for just a second. I spent 24 years in the United States Army. If I were an enemy to the country, and if I wanted to destabilize the United States in the face of a potential future confrontation, this is exactly what I would do, right? Look at the Ukraine model that Putin vetted by sending migrating people into the Donbas and those areas, and then those individuals became the saboteurs when the conflict happened. And I'm not suggesting that in the case of China, particularly, that they're going to be invading the United States any day soon, but they might very soon invade Taiwan. And if we were to become involved, having the thousands of people here, and again, you've asked me to speculate, right? So I'm sharing what I would be thinking about as a military guy trying to defend this country. Those individuals are here now because of this open, porous border, or the catch and release policies, and that is a threat that has to be defended against and prepared for.
Second
Okay.
question, Constitution. As you well said, part of the impeachment case was the Secretary refused to enforce the law as Congress intended. He got by with it, and if I'm a cabinet appointee in the future, why should I follow the law?
That's the whole point we were trying to make, right, is that we write the law, they execute the law. We now have allowed an executive branch official, a cabinet-level secretary, to not only not follow the law, but to violate the law. And we've done nothing to him other than impeachment. He gets to wear that, being the sole cabinet secretary, sitting cabinet secretary in the history of the country to be impeached. He'll wear that, through history. But the failure to remove him from office from that is an incentive to people to do whatever they want. We just further strengthened the royalty of the executive branch.
If I could just add that Justice Kavanaugh actually asked Biden's Solicitor General at the oral argument, well, what if the administration decides we're not going to enforce the environmental laws? We're not going to enforce the labor laws. And what about that? And the Solicitor General, Biden's Solicitor General, said, yeah, that's consistent with your precedent, the Supreme Court. There's nothing that can be done about that. That's the decision of the executive branch.
So is Congress no longer the first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, so here's the problem. The Senate's failure to remove Mayorkas has resulted not only in an incentive to an executive branch abuse of power in the future, but a disincentive for Congress to pass legislation. Because think about it. If you have someone in the executive branch in charge of enforcing any law you produce, and that executive official has demonstrated a willingness to simply ignore what might be carefully negotiated provisions, perhaps some members would only vote for a piece of legislation because it had enforcement provision A, B, and C. Maybe they go along with X, Y, and Z, which are weaker provisions, only because of the A, B, and C. But if the person sitting at the top of the branch charged with enforcing it decides to ignore A, B, and C, then the entire point of your support of the legislation has evaporated. That is going to have huge ripple effects downwind in terms of a reluctance of members in this space to support legislation, knowing that any provisions in it could be ignored by the executive branch with impunity.
Great point.
Now, I mean, we had a question that sort of relates to that, is does the Senate actions basically change the ability of impeachment or the threat of impeachment as a tool in reining in the executive? I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, Senator Schumer literally said, we no longer have to hear evidence. I decide and we vote, period. I mean, it is really amazing. I mean, that, for all practical purposes, eliminates the impeachment clause from the Constitution, and it now sets this precedent. Democrats have a way of setting horrible precedents that help them in the near term, but will redound to their detriment in the far term.
in a sense, though, it doesn't really repeal the impeachment clause. It just makes it a partisan tool exclusively. In other words, if
I think they already did that.
Yeah, they already did that,
Yeah.
exactly. In other words, essentially with the Trump impeachments, and now with not even participating as they're supposed to under the Constitution in this one, ironically, they have completely politicized the impeachment process.
And there's a doctrine called the political question doctrine, in which the Supreme Court has said they will not hear a case challenging the constitutionality of an act like that of Senator Schumer. If the power is in the hands of a branch like the Senate and they exercise it poorly, the courts will not get involved. This is going to be a case for the electorate to decide whether that was an appropriate action or not.
Right. And so what can Congress do? The question came in, what actions are left to Congress to support the rule of law?
Well, that's a good question. Clearly, we can make the laws more detailed and specific, although that, as has been mentioned, is a challenge under the current incentives that have been created by Schumer's action. I honestly believe that precedent, if there are leaders and if they're strong, and if that majority is strong enough, meaning you have a large majority that wants to take action, the precedent can be undone. So I do believe the precedent can be undone, and I'd be interested to hear, these are my lawyers, I'm a physician, so, I rely on them very heavily, but I do believe that if we have strong leadership and if we have a strong enough majority, we can reverse the precedent. But
the problem is that in a 51%, 49% country, not just Congress, you don't end up with those kind of majorities.
I'd be surprised if the country's viewpoint really divides along the way the elections go. But that's just a personal
We had a
opinion.
question from the audience?
Is there not a case to be made that Mayorkas has not fully gotten away with this, and that ex-secretary of Mayorkas could be prosecuted with a special prosecutor or another administration looking back on events? And that's the nature. They've got plenty of them. John Mitchell left office and was prosecuted later for crimes. There's a whole long precedent of making sure that impeachment is not the only remedy when officials violate their obligations.
I mean, and I'd like to hear what Paul would have to say, but for the most part, other than possible instances of perjury and testimony to Congress, his failure to abide by the law was not criminal offenses. And a lot of the impeachment report laid out the case that the Founding Fathers never, in their minds, wanted there to be a requirement that impeachable offenses be criminal acts. So most of what he did were not criminal acts. They were failure, abdication to fulfill his duty to enforce the law. And so other than possible perjury in some instances, I'm not sure what criminal case could be brought against him.
And that's what I meant when I said we could be more detailed in our laws. We can put teeth in things, and probably should.
And has along these lines, or along what you were saying, George, the take care clause of the Constitution, the president shall take care to see the laws are enforced, has that ever been litigated? Is it even litigatable? What's the story with that? Because that's kind of what we're talking about.
Well, my understanding is that obligation only adheres to the president, not to cabinet officials. But one of the many unfortunate aspects of Justice Kavanaugh's decision was he clearly implied in his decision that no one, no state, no individual, no one might have standing to challenge a president's failure to fulfill his constitutional obligation to see that the laws be faithfully executed. It's just hanging out there, but it was clearly implied in his decision, and that's very unfortunate.
Can Congress, in future legislation, just create a cause of action like that?
It can, except that standing is sort of it's a constitutional principle based on there has to be a
Case and controversy.
case and controversy in order for a court to take it up.
There's this phrase, there has to be a case and controversy at issue before the Supreme Court will hear the case, and that relates to this issue of standing. The Supreme Court has reserved to itself the ability to decide whether or not there's a concrete enough injury on the part of a given party to be able to bring the case.
Yeah, and Justice Kavanaugh said in his opinion, maybe if Congress did something like that, had a specific cause of action in the statute, maybe that would influence us in finding standing, but it still would be the Supreme Court's decision based not on statute, but on their view of the Constitution.
Interesting.
Kavanaugh on the decision, which is interesting, he literally raised that proposition and prospect, but then at the end of the sentence sort of dismissed it. You could try it, Congress, but we don't have to accept it. Not much help.
I should say that Justice Alito's dissent was one of the most fiery, in my mind, inspiring dissents I've ever read, and it was sort of occasioned by some really outrageous implications if you take Justice Kavanaugh's reasoning, down the path to the ultimate level. It has some really frightening implications.
We had the last question.
So on a different note, we heard that the Biden administration is thinking about bringing refugees, Palestinian refugees, especially from Gaza, whether they are from Gaza or they made it out, and especially those that are family members here. Looking at what's happening on campuses right now and other security concerns, we think that would be a good move. And can Congress do anything about it if you think it's really happening?
The Inspector General at Homeland.
Just so that people could, the question was, should we be, there's been reports that the administration wants to bring refugees from Gaza here, and is that a good idea, and can Congress do anything about it?
So the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security had some very interesting insight into the way the Biden administration brought Afghans back to the United States. And if that is how they intend to do it, absolutely, that'd be a horrible idea, right? So if they're going to follow their own pattern of how to execute something like this, a non-combatant evacuation type operation, they absolutely can't do that. I mean, they put the United States at risk in in the way they executed getting those individuals back. So I don't trust the Biden administration to do it well or correctly. And all people have to do is go look at the IG's report on how it was handled in Afghanistan.
I think I want to sort of respect people's time. We're at just about 1 hour. I want to thank everybody. Before that, I want to make clear the reports that the staff prepared, hundreds of pages, thousands of footnotes, they're all available on the Homeland Security Committee website. It's all there, chapter and verse, that this was not a sort of a, spur of the moment dispute over policy, because after all, Republican Congress didn't impeach Jay Johnson, who was Obama's Homeland Security Secretary, and while I had disagreements with him, he wasn't breaking the law. And so the point is, the committee's work makes that case in great detail, and it's worth remarking on how important that is. So I want to thank you.
Sure. If I could just say, I think we owe, the nation owes, and I certainly owe, a debt of gratitude to the staff of the Committee of Homeland Security, to the folks that we brought in to help us with this process for a months-long, almost year-long, that you referenced the reports of, but there were people working late nights for a year, producing preparatory work for hearings, multiple hearings, And to have people denigrate the process as something that happened, willy-nilly is a real disrespect to the individuals who worked so hard on it. So I want to thank my staff on behalf of the American people for the hard work that they did to prepare all of that.
Thank you, Chairman Mark Green of the House Homeland Security Committee, Paul Taylor and George Fishman, and thanks to all of you for coming in, and this will be available on our website, and you won't be able to ask questions because the live stream is over, but I think we had a lot of interesting and useful information here. Thank you.
Thanks for putting it on.